Hello and welcome to Book Review with a Boy. So I'm just gonna go ahead and start. As the video title hopefully and probably says, what I'm reviewing and talking about today is the book Coraline. I think in the past I've mentioned how I'm not a super big movie person, but one of my favorite movies is Coraline, and I feel like this book is also probably one of my favorite books. So overall, I'm going to be talking about this book, kind of background knowledge about it first, and then I'll actually be talking about the book itself in terms of like the characters and plot. So probably one of the biggest facts about this book overall is that it was written by Neil Gaiman. Overall, Neil has been a writer, he's been a voice actor. Some of the work that you may know him for is stuff like Good Omens, which is a pretty famous TV show. He also worked on something called American Gods. A lot of what he's known for and he tends to work on is like Greek mythology kind of stuff. A video I watched that was kind of like an interview for him, I think was through Wired, so I'll probably link that if you kind of want to get to know more about him specifically. And then probably the second most important person for this book would be Dave McKeon. I think I'm saying that right, maybe not. But Dave for this book is the illustrator, which I'll show some pictures later from the book, but they're all really good, and he's worked on some stuff like The Day I Swapped My Dad for Two Goldfish and Mirror Mask, but this is the only book I know their work from, and it's really good. Now on the publishing side of things, it was actually done by two different companies. You had Bloomsbury Publishing in the UK, and then you had HarperCollins in the US. So it's two different companies, don't know why, but that's kind of cool, because then the book can go more places. I think that's fun. And somewhat related to that information, the actual book was published on July 2nd of 2002, so it's been around for like, I think 20 years at this point. It's kind of old. It's like almost as old as I am, which is kind of cool. Now I know this piece of information sometimes dictates whether or not a person will actually pick up a book. The page number for it in terms of reading is about 159, and then in total it's about 210. And I say 210 in total because the beginning of the book is kind of like, I'm writing this book for this person, thank you this person. But in terms of like the actual story, that's about 159 pages. I think that mainly depends on what actual copy you're reading from. Finally, another piece of general like background knowledge that may or may not determine whether or not you read this book. The genre that this book falls under is mainly horror. It's kind of also dark fantasy, but it's kind of like a kid's book. So it's like the horror is to the limit that you can present children with, if that makes sense. Like essentially, if you've seen the movie, you know it's pretty dang spooky and it can kind of spook adults, but like it's not horrible, it's just a bit spooky, which I'll explain later. Also, before I go any further, I did just want to say I'm going to be explaining the plot, not very detailed, just giving a basic rundown that actually explains what happens at the end. So if you don't like spoilers, I would already just suggest reading the book. So to get us started with the actual contents of the story of the book, I would like to get us set with where the book actually takes place in terms of the setting. So essentially this book takes place in London/England. There's not necessarily a specific place, it's like this is where we're at. It's kind of just suggested that they're in England. In terms of some actual places that are specifically mentioned, you have the main setting, which is Coraline's house, like the place that she lives in this book. The house itself isn't necessarily just one main house. There are other like flats and rooms that other people live in, so it's not just Coraline and her family, it's other people, but it's one big house. Aside from the house, there are basically two other places that Coraline really talks about, which is some tennis courts, and there's an old well that she visits a few times, so it's mainly those three places that we kind of visit in the book. Now, before going into the plot of the book, I would like to give a very brief and basic rundown of the characters in the book. So as the book suggests, the main character of this entire story would be Coraline Jones. What you mainly need to know about this character is that she's very self-sufficient and self-determined to take care of herself. The entire book pretty much takes place like in her own perspective, where we get to see like how she thinks about certain things and what she does about what she experiences. And for the most part, she's like, well, I'm in this situation, so I gotta get through it, and she does. Other than that, some things you can know about her is that spiders make her uncomfortable. She wears like yellow Wellington boots. She wants to wear some green gloves, and she's got like a blue jacket. So that's kind of like a physical description, kind of. Most of the characters that Coraline meets in this book are all pretty much human, including her parents, Mr. and Mrs. Jones. Mr. and Mrs. Jones, because of what happens to them in the book, makes it to where they aren't really present that much, and even when they are, they're not necessarily mentally present, like they don't interact with Coraline that much. It is apparent that they care about Coraline, but because of their jobs and what they're doing in their adult parent lives, they kind of have other things to worry about other than Coraline, so that's kind of a common theme throughout the book, pretty much until the end. Another character that's really big in the book that actually isn't human would be the cat. There's not really a name for this character, it's just the cat. And as I'll go on to explain, this character essentially helps Coraline in her main world and kind of the world that she experiences in the house, and kind of helps her and gives her advice as she encounters different characters through the book to kind of help keep her alive. And the reason why I say this character helps to keep her alive is because there's characters like the other mother and the other father who interact with Coraline in the beginning, and it's very happy and it's like, yay, these are great characters, but later on it's not so much that. But essentially the other mother and the other father are kind of the opposite of Coraline's actual real life parents. They really care about her and kind of cater to her needs and her wants and what she likes. So they kind of spy on her almost, pretty much, and they try to kind of convince her that they're better than her actual parents. Two characters who occasionally interact with Coraline would be Miss Spink and Miss Forcible, who are essentially retired entertainers that kind of live in their glory days, and essentially what their main part in the book is that they kind of also give hints and help to Coraline when she needs it. They also have a lot of really cute Scotty dogs that they talk about a lot, and that's probably one of my favorite parts of the book, but I'll talk about that later. Now this next character is kind of confusing because we really don't see him that much, but it's Mr. Bobo, otherwise known as the crazy old man upstairs. In the very beginning of the book, it's kind of an awkward interaction that Coraline has with this dude because he essentially explains that he has these performing mice or rats that eventually kind of want to perform for Coraline, and she's like, okay, that's really cool. And she kind of questions where he's from because he has an accent, so it's he's either Slovenian or some form of Eastern European, but she's not quite sure. The last set of characters in this book that are introduced would be the ghost children, which really aren't in the book until the very end. But essentially Coraline meets these ghost children through the other mother as some form of punishment, and she kind of helps them out by trying to escape later on, which I'll kind of explain a little bit. And to do so, I will now start into the plot section of this movie, and the very beginning of the book is the fact that Coraline and her parents move into a new house. And once Coraline and her parents move into this house, at the very beginning she's pretty much tasked by both of her parents to explore the house and kind of meet the neighbors. So that's when she kind of meets Miss Spink and Miss Forcible, as well as the old crazy man upstairs. And what essentially sets the theme for the entire book is the fact that once Coraline meets her neighbors and kind of talks to her parents and starts to get settled, she realizes that everything seems, at least at the moment, really boring. And kind of what starts the whole plot of Coraline exploring more of the house is the fact that she realizes and becomes very upset by the fact that no one seems to at least really care about her and what she's doing. She seems kind of one of the younger people in her closer area to the house, so she's like, I have no one to be entertained by, I'm gonna have to entertain myself, I guess. And if you've ever been a person where you're kind of the new kid or someone who's new to a friend group, it kind of feels like that. You're there and you know people know you're there, but they don't seem to really care, so you're like, this isn't really fun. So as I've mentioned, the beginning of the book is Coraline moving into this new house, meeting her neighbors, kind of meeting the area, and everything seems really boring. But there's one non-boring thing, which is this random door in the house. Now the door itself, when she kind of finds it and shows her mom the door, she's like, this seems really weird, and her mom gets a key and kind of tries to open it, and it eventually leads to nothing, at least at first. But a little bit later on, Coraline does a little bit more digging, and she is able to eventually unlock the door and kind of explore some of the flats that are seemingly empty on the other side of the door. But after a little bit of walking and exploring, Coraline does find this other world where her other mother and other father are. So it's kind of a separate world that looks kind of the same as the one she's used to, but it is different because the people in this world seemingly care for her overall well-being, which isn't necessarily the case. And without going into a bunch of detail, what Coraline essentially finds out is that the other mother specifically doesn't really care for Coraline at all. Rather, she kind of wants to devour Coraline entirely and turn her into one of the ghost children. And what this pretty much turns into is the fact that Coraline is kind of seeing the differences between the normal world and the other world that has the other mother and the other father that all really love her and like kind of cater to her interests and are like, we really would like you to stay here. And what Coraline decides to do is that she wants to play a game with the other mother in an attempt to grab a key to get to the door to escape from this world so she doesn't get killed, essentially. And what the game boils down to is that it's pretty much a dark version of hide and go seek, because Coraline has to kind of find some artifacts of the ghost children, but she also kind of has to find her parents because she's kind of under the impression that the other mother kind of stole and hid her parents, so that's kind of the game Coraline's playing on her end. And if Coraline happens to win, the other mother will essentially let her escape, have her parents, and set the ghost children free, and give Coraline the key to go through the door to leave. And Coraline does play the game, she plays it very well, because she has this little artifact that she got from Miss Spink and Miss Forcible that in the other world kind of helps point out where the ghost children kind of artifacts are, so she does well on that end. And by the time that Coraline confronts the other mother, she's still kind of struggling because she doesn't exactly know where her real parents are. So to kind of escape and cheat the other mother, Coraline uses the cat friend that she has in the real world and the other world to kind of attack the other mother, get the key, go through this whole battle with the other mother and escape through the door, and it's kind of traumatic, but she does kind of win. And it does kind of seem like Coraline wins in a way because there's a hand that comes off from the other mother that goes into the real world after Coraline, which it kind of just sounds creepy because it's trying to get the key so it can unlock the door and kind of like destroy Coraline's world, but she kind of like puts it down a hole and is like, it's just gotta stay there. Great. So that's kind of the plot. It's like Coraline moves into a house, sees other people that are like her parents, but not really. Those people want to eat her, so she has to escape through hide and seek and kind of wins. Yeah. I'll probably put a link to a website that gives a more detailed description of it. I just kind of wanted to explain the book without giving too many spoilers, because I feel like that's kind of fair. Like, if you really want to read it, I definitely suggest it, but I don't want to completely spoil it. Yeah. Now, before I go into some other areas of discussing this book, I wanted to discuss the forms in which this book comes from, because originally it is a book. However, if you don't necessarily like to read, which I totally get, there are other ways to learn what the book is about. One of the bigger ones that I feel like most people are familiar with, which I saw first, would be the film. The whole reason why I got this book in general is because I saw the movie a long time ago, and I feel like it's probably going to be one of my favorite movies of all time. And it's like, if you ask someone if they've seen it and they're like, it's really scary, that's a fair point, but also I think it's just really cool. So there's the film version, there's a comic book version, there's also a video game version, which isn't necessarily as accurate. I mean, what can you do? But there is that if you're an epic gamer. And last but certainly not least, there's apparently a musical and an opera of Coraline, which I've never seen either of those, but that sounds fantastic. Now briefly, I did want to mention at least one quote that's in the book, but also in the film and probably in other things that is really good, and it is, "You have a very funny way of showing it," which is in reference to when the other mother says that she loves Coraline, but when you know her true intentions, which aren't good intentions, that kind of like explains why the quote is the way it is, because Coraline's like, you kind of want to eat me, so that's kind of awkward. So I'll probably put that quote in the description as well as a few others that I think are really fun, so if you want to read those, feel free. So for the second to last section of the video, I would kind of like to explain the differences and the similarities between the book and the film, because those are kind of the ones I'm most familiar with, and I always just kind of think it's fun to see like what a movie kind of sticks with, because I feel like that's always a big thing. People are like, I don't like the movie version of book because it's bad and not include minor detail, and it's like, it's a movie, so I don't know what to tell you. Anyways. So to start off, I feel like one of the biggest differences between the book and the movie is the fact that the movie has an entirely extra character called Wybie. I was really looking forward to read about Wybie in the book, and I was really confused when he wasn't there, because he's not. And I looked into this because I was confused, because Wybie's pretty much in the movie the entire time, so it's like, why is he not in the book? And apparently there's an interview with Neil where he essentially says he kind of wanted Wybie, this like little boy character, to be a friend to Coraline, to kind of like help Coraline have a conversation with someone other than herself. Because as I already kind of mentioned, Coraline pretty much just has herself in the book the entire time, so they added this extra character in the movie to kind of just be like an added bonus to help her feel like she's not so alone, because when you read this book, which I'll hopefully talk about in a second, she is like so independent and she goes through so many struggles by herself, which is kind of anxiety inducing, but it's also very interesting. So that's like kind of a big difference between the book and the movie. Another big difference between the book and the movie is the fact that all of the animals pretty much talk. In both the book and the movie, there are pretty much 3 different kinds of animals. You have like the mice and rats, you have the Scotty dogs from Miss Spink and Miss Forcible, and then you also have the cat. But what kind of confused me is that in the book, Coraline is in the other world and she sees the Scotty dogs in kind of a theater for Miss Spink and Miss Forcible, and they talk to her, which in like the movie, the dogs don't talk, they just bark. The only like animal character that talks is the cat. So it wasn't necessarily a weird thing, like I kind of did like how the dogs talked in the book. I was just like, oh, this is different. Another difference between the book and the film is that in the film, there's a lot of talk and kind of mention of like a garden that Coraline goes to, whereas in the book, there's a garden that's mentioned, but she doesn't really go to it that much. Like in the film, essentially the garden in the beginning of the movie is just kind of like this ugly garden that isn't really cared for much, but then in the other world, it essentially looks like Coraline to kind of entice her to stay there, whereas in the book, the garden's like mentioned maybe a few times, but nothing really happens. So I don't know why that happened, but it's kind of cool to just see that difference. Now this difference is one that's kind of interesting just from like a writer's perspective, because in the book, the setting, as I mentioned, takes place in like England, kind of London-y, but in the film, it's pretty much set in the USA. They don't really say where, but it's like in the US. And in the book, you can really tell it's like set in England because Coraline and some of the other characters say a lot of British words. You have stuff like flat, like the house as I was describing in the beginning. There's flats, which I believe is like a very British thing. We live in flats. They say sausages, and it's spelled like S-O-S-S-A-J-E-S, sausages. Coraline says mum a lot, which is interesting. They also say trod, as well as lovey. I think it's Miss Spink or Miss Forcible that says lovey a lot, and I think that's like love, but it's like lovey. Very British. Yes, beans on toast. So although it's kind of like a weird difference to see that they kind of made it like Americanized in the film version, I kind of like seeing the differences in words and stuff and dialect in the book. I think that's kind of cool. There's a very minor detail in terms of the placement in the book, like there's something called the drawing room that Coraline can't really go to, and then in the other world, it's like where the other mother's main kind of like lair is, and then in the film, it's like Coraline goes there eventually, and it's like, it's this evil bug room, but it's not really called the drawing room, it's just kind of like a weird minor thing. I was like, what is that? But anyways, that's kind of a small difference. Another difference is that in the book, Mr. Bobo, who has like the mice and rats or whatever, in the book they're mainly just rats. Like they're described as like having small bodies with like black fur and red beady eyes. They can also apparently sing, whereas in the film they're like mice in the beginning that do little circus things, and then they turn into rats eventually. So it's kind of funny to see how the movie did it a little bit differently, but it's kind of similar, but also the book, the rats can sing. So I guess that's a bonus. I've kind of pointed it out repeatedly, but one of the big differences between the book and the film is that Coraline is by herself pretty much the entire time. In the sense that she has to think of the solutions to all of her problems and pretty much entertain herself the entire book. As I mentioned, in the film, they have the extra character of YB to kind of help defend Coraline against some of the other characters and have general conversations, whereas in the book, it's just Coraline having to solve the riddles, play the game, kind of confront some of the characters that kind of just want to like kill her. So it's kind of like more intense seeing her try to get through everything by herself. Some small things that I noticed that were in the book in comparison to the film is the fact that the green little stone that I mentioned that helps Coraline to find some of the ghost children stuff, at some point there's like a green fire that Coraline sees. That's like, I don't think in the movie, but it's in the book. Something that they kept in the book that I was like, that's kind of random, but I guess so, is the tea leaf reading that's in the movie as well. I was like, I guess they'll keep that, sure, okay. In the book, there's like a random gust of wind for some reason, which when you read it, it's like, it makes more sense. But it's still kind of like, I don't know why that wouldn't be in the movie if it was important in the book, but whatever. There's kind of like a visual difference between like the hand segment at the end of the book in comparison to how the movie does it, because if you watch it in the movie, the other mother's hand is kind of like a wiry kind of metal thing, whereas in comparison to the book, I wrote down the quote, it's like a white hand with crimson fingernails, so it's almost like a legit hand, which is kind of creepier almost because it's like legit hand. But that was just a small difference. I was like, okay, cool. One of the big differences that was surprising to me, but I thought was really effective in the book, is the fact that when Coraline has to go against some of the other like neighbors in the house in the other world, like she fights kind of against Miss Spink and Miss Forcible, and then she sees like the rats with Mr. Bobo. There's this other segment in the book where Coraline goes to see the other father, and he's essentially discussed as like this meaty blob. Whereas with the film, and this kind of ties in with the whole garden thing as well, the other father kind of turns into a pumpkin. So I don't know where the difference was when it was being made. Maybe it just sounded too scary, I don't know. But when you read the book, the other father, like visually, I just like thought of him as like this meaty, gross, sweaty blob that chases after Coraline. And it sounds horrible because she goes into this like little secluded downstairs area and she has to like climb a ladder to escape, and like the other father can't see. He's just like this wandering around blind, gross, meaty blob. I thought that was so scary and very interesting. So that's a difference kind of. I think the movie kind of made it less horrifying. So 10 out of 10. So the last difference that I noticed between the film and the book is that in the very beginning of the movie, you see this whole kind of like sing-song segment where later you find out it's the other mother making these dolls that represent the kids that she essentially is hunting. I think I like what they did with that because to me at least it shows like the other mother was kind of hunting and showing interest in Coraline earlier in the story, whereas with like the book, Coraline just so happens to find the door and then goes through it and meets the other mother, which is fine. So I don't really like mind that it wasn't in the book. I just think I like that they have that in the movie. So that's pretty much all the background and like different stuff I wanted to go over. I know long, but I was just like, that's interesting. Very quickly, before I go into like my general opinion on the book, I wanted to show some of the pictures because I feel like if you never see the movie, the way that the pictures are drawn kind of show you what the world may look like. I think they're cool. So here's one you can see, and it kind of shows a picture of like one of the rats like Coraline's kind of exploring, and I think in this segment it talks about how she hears one of the mice like running around, so that's like that, and then you can kind of see Coraline by the door, so pretty cool. I think this picture is kind of from the segment where Coraline first meets the other mother, and you can kind of see she just kind of generally doesn't look super pleasant but also not super threatening at the time. You can also kind of see like very slightly she has like the button eye thing, which is more traumatizing I feel like in the film rather than the book, but still cool. This is one of my favorite pictures from the book. It's like one of the Scotty dogs, and you can kind of see like Miss Spink and Miss Forcible in the back, but that's kind of like what they would look like, which I love dogs, so I thought that was fun. This is another picture kind of halfway through the book, and it's showing one of the rats holding the key to the door because it's kind of trying to help the other mother like not let Coraline escape, so that's kind of what that's showing. This is one of the more terrifying ones because it's once again the other mother, and it kind of shows her eating a bug, which is really gross. And it's also kind of the other mother threatening Coraline and being like, I'll keep you in this world and sew buttons into your eyes. So, you know, terrifying. This one may be a little harder to see, but it's essentially the 3 ghost children that Coraline meets. And I didn't really necessarily talk about this, but Coraline's kind of shoved into a box that you can kind of see there with the ghost children as like a form of punishment from the other mother. So the way the scene is described is kind of spooky because it's like Coraline is in this dark kind of spot and then these ghost children are there and it's like, what's up? This one is pretty much the only visual representation that we have of Mr. Bobo, and it kind of shows him with one of the rats on top of him, which is kind of spooky, and in this segment he's kind of threatening, so pretty fun. This is pretty much at the end of the book, where Coraline is fighting against the other mother, and she does it by throwing the cat character onto the other mother to escape. This is one of the more pleasant pictures where we see Coraline hanging out with her mom and dad and eating pizza, and they're all kind of enjoying a moment together, which is pretty nice. This is also pretty much at the very end, and this is kind of where I was describing like the other mother's hand gets cut off, which is kind of traumatizing, and it's kind of just trying to follow Coraline around. So it's like, if you could imagine that chasing after you, pretty spooky. This is the last picture in the book, and it's essentially of Mr. Bobo's mice, like, in their band uniforms, because Mr. Bobo essentially alludes to the fact that he wants the mice to play for Coraline, and the mice themselves kind of congratulate Coraline because they, like, saved them from, like, the other world, kind of, because everything is pretty much, like, flipped from, like, the normal world, so the mice kind of, like, know what's going on, so they're like, yeah, music. But that's pretty much all the background information and stuff that you generally need to know. That was long, I apologize. In terms of my opinion of the book, I definitely, as I've already said, think it's one of my favorite books. I would definitely say it's an easy read coming from someone who's like, one of my favorite books is like The Very Hungry Caterpillar. So the font size is pretty good, and then the chapters are split up pretty evenly. They're kind of longer towards the end just so you get more of the plot in, but it's all kind of spread out really nicely. In terms of my favorite characters from the book, I don't think Coraline's my favorite because she's kind of indifferent to stuff and kind of annoying, but also she's going through trauma, so I get why she would be complaining at parts. I think the cat is one of my favorite characters. I also like the Scotty dogs, although they also kind of get terrifying towards the end of the book, but whatever. I think one of my favorite characters would be Mr. Jones because he does also kind of show indifference to Coraline because he's so busy, but he's also like a computer epic genius, and then he's like, Coraline, to entertain yourself, go count blue things in the house. Like, I don't know what to tell you, just do something. And sometimes I get that. So like, I think he's one of my favorites, except when he becomes a meaty blob, because I think that genuinely kind of spooked me. I was like, this is a bit terrifying. Would I say that this book is absolutely horrifying? No. Whenever I hear people say they can't watch it or read it because it's too scary, I'm like, bruh, it's fake, but okay. In a way, I feel like I almost have a bias for how much I like the book and the movie because I love animated stuff and I saw the movie first, and I have such a big respect for like claymation and like stop motion stuff, which is what the movie is, which I like love so much. So I think I like it because of that, and because it's kind of spooky, like kids can read it and watch it and not necessarily be traumatized. So it's kind of fun to have like a spooky kids movie kind of. So all of that essentially is to say, if you would like to read it and you're not necessarily scared of spooky stuff, I would definitely give it a read. It's very good. If I had to rate it out of like, I don't know, 10 stars or something, like 10 green artifact things, like out of 10 ghost children, I'd give it 10 out of 10 ghost children. But that is essentially it. I will probably leave a link to like an Amazon thing of this, maybe like a Barnes & Noble or like Books A Million link if you would like to get the book, because it's really not that hard to get through. So very fun. I like it. I'll probably try to read other stuff from Neil Gaiman because it was really good and I liked it. But that's it. If you have any questions about the book, because I talk fast and don't explain things super well, feel free to let me know if you have any questions. But that is about it. So thank you very much for watching. Bye.